Welcome to Delivered. My name's Chris, and I'm here to drink a cold brew and talk about innovation, great products, and even greater companies. I'll be joined by some specialists in the space of technology, design, building companies. So much to learn. You're all welcome to come with me. Let's learn together and figure all this out. Let's go. Today we're talking to Mark McDermott, a true expert in digital products. Mark has built a SaaS business that leverages software to enable screens that communicate. His company, ScreenCloud, is now one of the market leaders in digital signage, and he's going to tell us all about the learnings and how they got there. Mark McDermott, welcome to Delivered. Great to have you.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
I'm actually very excited today because I know you're a man that's delivered most things in the digital space over the last 20 years. So agencies, products, SaaS companies.
23 years.
But who's counting?
Yeah, I know.
So rather than me paraphrasing, I'd love to dive in maybe just to you and how Mark McDermott became the CEO of ScreenCloud. And what is ScreenCloud?
Yeah, well, I'll start with ScreenCloud because that's probably easier to explain than my checkered history. But ScreenCloud is a B2B SaaS platform for digital signage. So basically think of like all the screens you see out in the world. Most people are probably familiar with outdoor advertising screens or screens in quick serve restaurants like McDonald's showing menu boards, or the screens you see at airports and things like that. So they usually see them in like, those kind of retail commercial environments. So we are basically one of the platforms that powers all of those networks of screens, keeps them active, keeps them on, helps customers deliver content there. But we actually focus more on screens that communicate. So we're on usually employee-facing or student-facing screens in anything from universities through to logistics. So kind of think of truck depots or manufacturing, communicating mainly to a deskless or frontline workforce, keeping them up to date with what's going in the company, productivity information, dashboards, things like that, but all through the medium of screens. So that's ScreenCloud in a nutshell. We have 9,000 customers. Mostly in the USA, and the team is 110 and growing. And we're probably moving now from being a startup, we started 8 years ago, into now what I would call a growth stage or a scale-up company. So that's kind of ScreenCloud in a nutshell. In terms of me, as we said, I was just turned 44 this week, so reflecting on age a bit. So I started my technology career when I left university in the year 2000. I was originally in corporate IT, working for a large consultancy, which ultimately sold to IBM. Then I moved into the web agency world, so did design and build projects, and actually started with my two co-founders of ScreenCloud, our own web design agency in 2000. I started in 2003, but 2004. We ran that quite successfully. Obviously, that was just a profitable business. You don't usually get investment for those kind of companies. Picked up quite a lot of good brand names along the way, like British Airways and Nestle and Microsoft and BBC. Grew that agency to about 30 people. And then we started to reinvest the money that we were making in profit from that agency into our own product lines. And we did loads and loads of different product experiments, some quite successful, some total fails, some few interesting stories. One was worth 100 million at one point, and then 8 months later was worth 0. So that's kind of funny, sort of, and painful. So a lot of different things along the way. We kind of built some product and startup muscle. And then when ScreenCloud came along in 2014, we realized this was a really big opportunity. We saw a gap in the market for what we were doing. We felt we could make a big difference in this category. So we decided to go all in on that in 2015. And then in 2017, we sold our agency, sold off some of the other products or shut them down, and then focused completely on ScreenCloud. And that's kind of where we are today. But lots and lots of stuff happened in that time. Lots and lots.
And I appreciate that's probably a really short synopsis. And what I loved is like, it's not this rainbow coated like success story. It's from pain, failures, successes. And actually, I think that embodies products in general, from my experience.
And I guess really what you're talking about there is, delivering these things to customers. It sounds like you started from maybe a micro point and just scaled and scaled and scaled to now on a global platform and delivering to a mass market. So that must be quite rewarding and challenging and probably painful, like you mentioned.
Oh yeah, I mean, just the ScreenCloud story alone has got like massive cycles of ups and downs. I mean, there's been years where we've been on like a crazy growth tear, like just incredible. And then years like the first year of COVID, where most of our customers were forcibly shut, and so suddenly what was only ever going up and to the right suddenly was going down and to the right, and not looking as rosy, and we had to adjust. And then we're going through this sort of interesting economic time now, which has some challenges on budget and stuff. So I mean, all through my career it has been looping cycles of sort of boom and bust to some degree. And actually, funny enough, last week I was invited by an old friend of mine to give a talk to a group of sixth formers who were just leaving school, kind of about this sort of subject. And I found it quite a hard thing to write, because I was like, well, how's a 17-year-old really going to relate to me? And well, what can I tell them that is going to be useful? So when I reflected on my whole career and everything that's happened, not just to me, just to us and the business and everything, I realized that there is this kind of common looping pattern of things working really well, then not well, then some kind of like macro shake up, a bit of a shock, and a bit of a reset, and then having to pick yourself up and go again. But actually, often what I noticed, optimistically speaking, is that out of the back of a lot of the challenges and the problems, whether it be macro, whether they be our own screw ups, I mean, there've been a few of them as well, is it has paved the way for better things always. And there is this sort of, I guess, kind of, I don't know what philosophy exactly it would be, but you kind of have to make room. You have to make space for better things to happen, and sometimes that space is forcibly pushed on you, and sometimes you have to make some hard decisions. And everything looks much more straightforward looking backwards, but when you're facing those decisions, it can be pretty daunting. But yeah, there's been a huge amount, and ScreenCloud certainly had a few of them.
I think from my point of view, the failure point is a really good point to start with here. 90% startups can fail. The stats around 95% of digital products in the first year. Even things like digital transformation, they can fail as well. It's a painful experience for the people, especially. I suppose you've gone through that numerous times in different ways, but actually with ScreenCloud, you come out of it with a success story. And I'd love to hear about the kind of key decisions you made as the leader or one of the founders to kind of get you to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for everything. Although maybe I can, because I'm the only one on the podcast today. But no, like very much kind of credit goes to my other co-founders and my team as well, in some of the good decisions, and I'll take the blame for the bad ones. That's what a good CEO is supposed to do. Credit the team and then take the shit. Basically, I think where we did well in ScreenCloud, where we maybe previously haven't done as well, was what I call like surfing waves, right? So that if there's a momentum wave that's going. Now, the thing about surfing a wave is it might fairly easy to spot a wave, but it's actually not easy to time one. So even if you spot it, you could still screw it up by going too early or too late. So it's kind of a dual thing. You've got to see the wave, then you've got to time hitting it exactly the right point. And actually going too early is probably worse than going too late. Because it's very, very painful waiting for the market to catch up with you. You spend a lot of money trying to do that. So back in the day when we started, what we noticed was there was a big change going on in consumer screen hardware. So the screens that you would use at home, mainly driven by the streaming services, effectively saying to the TV screen manufacturers like Samsung, LG, etc., like your smart TVs just aren't smart enough. They don't run web content or web applications well enough. So we're going to basically build our own little dongles to stick in the side and bypass your crappy OSs. So things like Amazon Fire TV and Google Chromecast were becoming really popular. Now, the idea, this is Luke's idea really, was could we leverage this kind of home technology for a business use case? Because one, people understood it because they were using it at home, and two, it's extremely affordable and accessible. So you didn't have to suddenly go through these old school reseller channels to try and actually buy this stuff. So by basically the kind of the main promise was, well, if we can make it work, then what we're really saying to people is, look, if it can withstand your Netflix binge, then it can probably work at work too. And most people were like, yeah, that's right. So, you know, you got past this idea of like consumer tech's not good enough for business. And I think that ship sailed long ago. I mean, think of like iPhones, they're basically consumer tech, now comfortably usable for business, like, you know, probably mostly used for business as a dominant device. So that wave was really powerful. And then the incumbents, they didn't surf that wave because they had the innovator's dilemma, I suppose you'd call it, which is, well, we make really high margin on these professional devices. If we acknowledge that you can work on that, then we're kind of like undercutting ourselves massively, and this is where we're making our cash. So it gave us this space to kind of evolve, because our product was very basic really to begin with, and it had a couple of key features that people liked. Like it was real time, and it was just also quite nicely designed. We brought a lot of the UX and UI influence of the web and mobile over to a category that hadn't really had a lot of software love. So they liked what they saw, they could see the promise there, and then they really liked that we kind of smashed the capex down to very affordable. And that was really what got us started. So that was kind of the wave one. But then inevitably, like those waves, you know, they hit the beach, and normally in the form of, when other people see what you're doing, you know, and they see it being successful, they will also kind of either basically copy it. I mean, you see that in social media right now, like Threads is just a total copy of Twitter, just because it's like, all right, that works, let's just do it, and let's just have a bigger distribution potentially. So other people will come in, and you lose what, you know, you get to surf it for a while, but you're kidding yourself if this is going to be it forever. It doesn't work like that, especially if it is relatively copyable, which most software is, and software isn't typically really a moat, but other things can be. So the second wave that we've been hitting is kind of more towards this insight that we got really through COVID, which was screens are quite well used in the commercial space, but they're really not very well used in places of work. And if you're a deskless or frontline worker, so someone who doesn't work on a laptop or have an email address or access to a lot of the comms channels that we use every day, they're basically digitally detached. They're in the dark. So the screen is actually the natural interface for digital content to be seen in that environment. I mean, if you just took ScreenCloud aside, like, and just said, what's the most natural digital interface for this environment? I think a TV screen is genuinely it, rather than anything else, like a shared computer in the corner or whatever. So suddenly you've got this opportunity, and then no one really doing it very well. So that's kind of where we're really pushing as our second wave, and that's also powered by things like the reindustrialization of America back from China, you know, and like things like there was the Great Resignation was another part of this, where it was actually hard to fill these jobs. So you've got these big kind of macro things, and you know, you've got to attach to those and surf away, but also acknowledge that there's more waves to come. If I haven't overstretched that analogy too far.
I love it though, and I think you touched on something really important. And I think around product market fit, and it's something I spend a lot of time at Infinum doing from like a strategy point of view. It's like a great product is software, yes, and technology, but it's about knowing who it's for, the price point, how you bring that to market. And it sounds like with ScreenCloud, you brought that to the market at the right price point to get away from that enterprise oversell and find a niche in that kind of the SME, SMB.
Yeah, SM, yeah. Well, funny enough, actually, yeah. So we were the low price entrant, and now there are the sort of copies of ScreenCloud which are now coming in half the price, and they hang on the brand terms, and it's kind of annoying. But yeah, so there is a bit of a race to the bottom. But I think the smart thing here was that whilst we were on, I mean, if you're familiar with the kind of SaaS terminology, like the very best SaaS companies, when they kind of start to generate revenue, they do the triple, double, right? That's so tripling in revenue annually, tripling, and then doubling and doubling. That is kind of like, that's like the gold standard for doing SaaS really, really well. And we were on that trajectory pre-COVID. But we actually took the bold decision, is whilst we were even tripling in size, to actually start rebuilding our whole platform to anticipate the needs of enterprise. knowing that probably the defensive moat around the SMB was going to end up being a race to the bottom on price once they caught up a bit. So we kind of got ahead of ourselves, and thankfully we did do that. So yeah, you've got to product market fit is almost like, it's not like a single thing. It's like you have it for a period, and then you've got to almost like anticipate what it's going to be again. So you've got to both catch current product market fit, but you've also got to have one eye down the road for like, what are the trends that are coming? And I call it this thing core and explore, right? And it's how we generally divide our kind of design and development product resources, basically. So 80% goes on core, which is like what you're building now, your roadmap, and 20% goes on these experimental down the road ideas. And right now, one of our biggest products, which is our own operating system for screens itself, it was an explore idea for for 1 year, just with a couple of developers on it, just working out the viability and testing it a bit with some customers. That's now one of our core. So it does move. Explore moves into core. It doesn't always do that. We've had other things which have kind of been dropped and not developed further. But yeah, it's a real fine balance. You know, you do feel a bit bipolar sometimes of like, but if you put them in those two buckets, it kind of helps you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I love what you're saying there about actually using discovery to kind of just validate an idea, test it, see if it works before you get to that production or call. Is such a smarter way of doing it, and I guess not risk free, but de-risks it a lot for someone investing.
Yeah. I mean, there's some. I mean, there will be like throwaway products which don't ever really make it, but comparatively, it's a relatively low amount of wastage. If you take like a cooking analogy, there's always going to be some wastage as you're preparing the meal, right? Yeah, I think it's very important to do that. And obviously, you want to have a reasonable hit rate and not just be exploring really crazy ideas. But a lot of those ideas, they don't come from sort of ideation sessions. They slap you in the face, usually from problems or from customer problems and feedback. And in fact, like the reason for building our own operating system, which is something that at the beginning I would have thought, oh my God, that would be a crazy thing to do. That's way too much for us. Like, why don't we just use the existing operating systems? Well, you have to learn by using those existing operating systems and realizing their faults and their issues. And the only real way to overcome it is effectively to do it yourself at a certain scale. And actually, after a particularly bad outage we experienced on one of the platforms, where we were really on our knees for about 5 days, and we had no way of really getting any leverage with it was on the Amazon Fire platform. It wasn't Amazon's fault, but it was kind of we had no proper relationship going there. We were completely stuck for 5 days, and we thought this could be a real terminal blow. Thankfully, we didn't. But that prompted that exploration of like, this is just too much risk. And if you're building too much on someone else's platform and they're not really engaged on it, then you are really open to so much risk. And actually, the risk of building yourself suddenly looks much less.
Yes, I totally agree. And I suppose with that mindset, I guess when you're going through that kind of early stage discovery, ideation, how important it is a UX to, a product that's on a global scale. And I know from your history, you have had an UX agency, so you might have a bit of an insight in that. But for the listeners, how important is that UX kind of story in their product development?
Well, I have this little phrase, which is that the best UX is no UX. And what I mean by that is the more invisible the experience feels, i.e. the more you can remove and anticipate, the better the experience. And I think that's one of where ScreenCloud's been really good. So one of the UX principles was minimal buttons. If you're editing a title, just click on the title and edit it, and then press return or whatever and click off it and it saves, rather than have loads of extra kind of cancel, approve. You still got buttons there, but buttons do key things, and everything else is just drag and drop and kind of click and it removes everyday workflow, which is what creates the delight in the experience of a product you're using every single day to update content. You'll appreciate those kind of little smooth outs in the workflow, that intuitive kind of anticipatory nature of the UX. So I think that was extremely important. That's something that people that wasn't in a lot of the legacy systems. It was just buttons everywhere, click, 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 click. And that's fine for one round, but often, you're maybe uploading and configuring 20 pieces of content at a time. That's going to get really laborious. So minimal UI, I suppose, created the best UX, is probably the best way of doing that. Yeah, and I think the other thing was this this delight moment that we created. I've got to credit Luke, my CTO co-founder, for this one. I didn't think, like, the industry norm was that the screens would update maybe after 5 or 15 minutes once you'd updated them, and they would sort of eventually the whole system would update. And so that was an industry norm, and I wasn't that compelled to change that. But for Luke, it was really important to him that when you made an update, the screen updated almost immediately. So he used like Firebase at the time, was kind of relatively new technology from Google, as this real-time database. And I was like, I thought it was a bit of a gimmick, if I'm honest, but customers just loved it. And what I hadn't anticipated was that they're on their laptop, they make a change, and then this test screen, which is probably in the same room as them, immediately updates. And it's that thought that this is fired up to the cloud, back down to the screen, and within a couple of seconds or less, this real-time magic, it feels like magic at your fingertips. And that created a moment which, just once a customer had seen that, I knew I'd close them. And that was Luke's insistence that real-time mattered. And honestly, like, he couldn't have been more right. So I think sometimes, so my point really here is that often we think of UX as being like wireframes and, all that kind of stuff. But actually, I emphasize the experience. And experience is those magic moments. It's that anticipation. It's that removal of unnecessary steps, which I suppose is more wireframey. But like, it's not just how it looks and feels is kind of my where I'd emphasize. And if you can create magic in a trial, then you will close customers.
Love it. Create magic. Done.
It's dead easy, right? It's become a magician.
In terms of customers in general, how important is customer feedback to you as well? Because I must imagine it's like a damning thing at times, but ultimately necessity to create great B2C products.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's an interesting I saw an interesting tweet the other day which said, like, the days of like, ship your first crappy, embarrassing product are over. And I sort of agree. I kind of think that actually no one really should ship anything truly embarrassing. I think the tolerance for like terrible first versions is pretty low, because like, really, life's too short to just be testing out terrible products and have them kind of fail on you. So I think that was a bit of an old trope. But how I think it really should be at the moment is that you should probably hang your first product on a couple of these key philosophies. So, what I was talking about there was, it works in consumer hardware. It's really nice and intuitive interface, and it has this real-time magic moment. And then, to be honest, the fact it didn't support vertical screens, didn't support like zones, it was only full screen, and all of that other stuff, which was kind of table stakes, didn't even work offline originally, which is quite important in that environment. But all of that stuff was like to be added, and people were like fine with that because they could see that your product philosophy stood out as something slightly different. So that bought you the time. At that point, apart from them saying you need to do the table stakes of work, which everyone just kind of usually intuitively knows, then you start getting that feedback loop. And yeah, some people can be a bit harsh, especially if they're more like, they're kind of some kind of old relationship to the incumbent. They generally will be a bit mocking, probably. But to be honest, that's probably not the market you're really going after. You're probably going after a new segment, or a segment that's pissed off with them for whatever reason. So their feedback matters. And actually, people, I think, are very respectful in that. And you can't hang it too much on one person's opinion, obviously, but it's not long before, maybe after even 4 or 5 chats, you start to feel the themes come out. And actually, recently I felt like, especially during the COVID years, we lost a bit of that feedback. We were really just getting more of like the bug-like feedback from support, which again can really bias you towards the people that email support are either the ones experiencing problems, and you've got to sort those out, or quite often, like, they're trying to push the product roadmap in a way that really suits them. You're much better off actually getting out into people who aren't going to necessarily just contact support and just witness it. And I think in COVID, that was really challenging. And I think that we lost our way a bit there with what really mattered. And then more recently, now I've been able to get back out on the road. I'm spending a lot more time personally, and so is our success team and product team, in those custom environments. And that's where you really start to pick things up, not just from the feedback they give you in the meetings and walking around, but in actually witnessing it. And especially for us, our end user is not someone who's our customer, right? So people who see the screens aren't people that are buying the licenses to run the screens. Our customer is really IT, internal comms, operations, HR, that kind of, the communicators who are more like in the corporate office. But our end users are those deskless workers and frontline workers, and we rarely get to speak to them. So it's really interesting for us to be there. So getting out into the real world, into the environment, not just waiting for support tickets to be your customer feedback, like, is super important. And everything is easier. It just becomes more clear what really matters and what doesn't. Whereas actually, I think in the COVID years, we had so many product ideas. It was like, where to focus. It's quite challenging.
It's interesting. And I think where I come in with things like strategy and product strategy mainly, I might be biased here because, I spend a lot of my time guiding companies, trying to chart the way ahead. How important is it with product strategy to have that roadmap, that clarity, and in many ways like a guiding principles that are combining like research, validation, the business needs and the market needs? I think that's something most companies don't necessarily look at when you think tech. They think we're going to build something, launch it, and it's great. My sensibility is always around, you kind of need that strategy first to know where you're going and sort of de-risk it on the way. How do you feel about that from a SaaS CEO of many years?
Yeah, I think it's going to sound a little bit contradictory, some of this stuff. So because it is basically you're sort of sailing through a fairly kind of narrow strait of like getting this successfully right, where you have to have a vision, you have to have a sense of like what you're trying to achieve and why that's different. And like there was obviously something that drew you towards this. And if that honestly was, oh, they're making money, so I could just do a cheaper version, then that's not a great strategy. But it will work to some degree. So yeah, I mean, it's not the most appealing one, but so you need to have identified something there which you feel is unique, which obviously others maybe have not seen for whatever reason. Maybe they've seen it and they tried it and it didn't work. That is also one outcome. But maybe they just, you're coming at it with a different lens. So in our case, I think that it was very interesting. I was looking at what had been historically a hardware-driven industry, which is really, digital design is really born out of the audio-visual industry. So there's still a latent obsession with hardware and less concern with what goes on that screen, more about the screen itself, right? Because that's where this has really evolved from. So suddenly coming into that industry and looking at everything through the lens of a web developer, it's a totally, just in its nature, it's a totally different outlook on the same problem. You're going to prioritize things that they wouldn't even care about. Now you're going to bounce in the middle because there are hardware considerations you basically learn and bump into. So you're going to find that middle, but in that tension, that's where the creativity comes. So yes, you've got to have that initial strategy, but then it has to be adaptable. I'll give you an example. So sort of almost slightly contradicting what I just said about the web developer thing. When we launched our first version, I was into the final bit of testing and I realized I hadn't tested the CMS product we built on a mobile. And I went on it and it was a disaster. Like it just didn't work. Like it was just terrible. Now, in 2015, going into 2016, launching as a, like someone who claims to be a pretty decent web developer, web product, for it not to work on a mobile is sort of like humiliation. And so I quickly got the team just to make a view that when it got down to the mobile view, it just said not optimized for mobile, but it will be soon. And I was like thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be torn to shreds. You know what? No one cared. No one ever cared. And actually that version of that product never worked on mobile. And it wasn't until we released our new version, that enterprise version in January 2020. That's the first CMS optimized mobile experience we ever built. So for 4 years, it never happened. Now, occasionally a customer will be like, WTF, but very, very occasionally. One guy on Twitter, like, sort of flamed us for it. He wasn't even a customer though, so who cares? And the marketing website worked on mobile, but the product didn't. And it's because basically everyone does the CMS content from a desktop or laptop. It just, but for me, that would have been the biggest priority post-launch, except no one cared.
I love that.
But they really cared about other things, like working offline, like be able to zone up the screen, vertical support. Like they cared about actually important stuff, and they just didn't care about this. And I thought that was really interesting. So my strategy would have been, this has to be the finest web developed product, because we're the finest web developers in this industry, in this category. And yet the thing that I probably would have thought was super important, there would have been quite a lot of effort to optimize. No one gave a shit. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to swear. I'm not allowed to swear.
But I love.
But no one cared. No one cared.
I love the fact that the one troll on Twitter did care, with no relation to the product. But
no, exactly. It was just, again, signal and noise, and that's why it is important, where probably most of the noise comes from your own head and your own team. But actually, really, it's about really knowing, and I kind of say this thing, you got to understand, you got to understand the reality of your customers rather than project your own opinions onto them. And quite often, I think this is probably a challenge when you're doing strategy sessions. We have such entrenched views about what does and doesn't matter that we try and project them too much and go, no, this is the right way. Actually, quite often, it just isn't. We waste so much time on stuff that just doesn't matter. So yeah, the short answer to your question is, like, you've got to have that strategy, that vision and plan, but it has to be loose enough to admit when you're wrong and to deprioritize things which just don't matter. But you have to still stand out a little bit. So it's a bit of an on the fence answer, right? But that's why it's so hard.
Well, I think that's true. And I think when we look at product strategy, we look at it as like a guiding principle, because it is about, like you say, it's time to get things done and decided quickly. It's to maybe align teams around what isn't important. And like you say, like, no one thinks your product is as important as you, because it's your product and it's your kind of like the baby you birthed into the world. And I find from strategy, bringing that to like a different team of people is a great way to unlock and facilitate disagreement, what matters, what doesn't matter, what the audience thinks. And I kind of, what we've done in the past for Infinium side is put a strategist at the start of the project, throughout that journey, and then multiple check-ins, just to really like reality check with the founders, C-suite team. Where is it going? Does it matter? Is it aligned to your business expectations? I think that is a strong way to help with, SaaS or any other type of business, if I'm really honest.
Yeah, actually reminds me of something someone once said to me. I was recently doing some interviews for chair roles for our board. So obviously quite wise and experienced individuals. And this one guy said, he goes, you got to differentiate strategy and plans. Strategy rarely changes and plans change all the time. And this is kind of how you can get around this sort of slightly kind of, like at odds issue of have this clear strategy, but like change all the time. And it's by putting them into those two buckets, because broadly, like, if you think our first strategy was to be, direct to customer, working on consumer hardware, super intuitive to use, modern web experience, like that strategy basically didn't really change. And then the plans of what we would then do changed radically, such as mobile support or whatever, and things like that. So actually you could almost separate it like that and say, like, strategy is big, bold, strong vision, really only changes when the facts seriously change. And then plans are really these sort of short, iterative things that you create to sort of, work against that strategy, but they can change all the time, as and when, feedback happens, shifts in the market, whatever it might be. And maybe that's an easier way of coming to peace with it.
I love that idea. And if I was a first-time entrepreneur looking to deliver digital products, or dare I say a digital product studio, or just a SaaS product, in your kind of like wisdom and final thoughts to kind of bring this to a nice collective wrap up, what would be your advice to that person?
So is this someone actually kind of trying to build their own team or find a team to work with to help build their product?
It's a good question. So let's say they are going to find a team to build their first digital product to bring some kind of value to their customers.
Right. Well, I've got experience of being kind of on the, being that team, right? The team that would build the first version for quite a few years. This is what we did. And there was a really, really obvious difference between the times that it worked and the times that it didn't work. And it really came down to trust. So I think when you go out to market and you look for a team, obviously you've got to do all of the various amounts of due diligence on their work, their clients, references, who the team actually is, levels of experience, do all of the stuff you would do, even if you were doing it for a house renovation or something. But once you have committed to that team, that's when you need to stop being really effectively part of that team. You need to trust that team. You need to listen to them. You need to guide them and become more of the product owner. And the product owner is really kind of what I try and do internally at ScreenCloud. Is occasionally I will dictate features, but it's quite rare. But mainly I feel I represent the customer internally. So, I think this person would represent not just their customer, but their vision for what they're trying to do, and just keep making sure that all decisions are being made against that reality. And that is going to work much better than what normally people do. Is they panic and then become micromanagers and start asking for, change that button, do that, and even start drawing it themselves. That just destroys trust. It destroys, to be honest, you're probably not very good at it anyway. We might have some good ideas, but the reality is it's going to be really messy. So, go in, and if you want to do all of that really detailed kind of deep dives on the team, do that before you appoint them. But once you appoint them, you got to switch that completely and go, right, my job is to be out talking to as many potential customers as possible, gathering as much intel from the market, the positioning of what we're going to do, and make sure that team is working against that honestly, but then also giving them the autonomy to do their best work, because people who get into this game do it for the love of building and for the love of creating. And if you stifle that, you just suck the oxygen out of the room. And I know it's scary, because often that will be your life savings, your friends and family money, your credit cards or whatever that's paying for it. But you've got to get over that. Otherwise, you're going to have a fail on your hands.
It's a very poignant and good way to kind of wrap this up. It's protect creativity, let the creatives and the experts deliver the product or the service you're hiring to do. And I think most of all, just thank you for sharing your kind of wealth of experience. I appreciate you being very open and honest about the whole thing, ups and downs and bits in the middle.
Pleasure. No, thank you for having me on, and I hope there were some useful nuggets for the audience.
That's great. Have a good day. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you once again to Mark McDermott for today's episode of Delivered. You can find all the information about Mark and ScreenCloud in the show notes. I recommend following them on their journey and getting in touch. If you want to make sure you deliver, and we would love for you to deliver, we can help you with any stage of the digital product creation process. Strategy workshops, design, engineering, we've got you covered. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to help you. Next time on Delivered, we're talking to Gareth Dimlow, who is the founder and chief storyteller of Inside Stories. He'll be talking to us about the importance of brand narrative and brand story, and how it can help your business connect with the right audience.